Good evening. Welcome to Talk Gnosis. Tonight we're being joined by Miguel Connor, who is the host of Beyond Bite Gnostic Radio, and also the author of the critically acclaimed Voices of Gnosticism and the post-apocalyptic vampire epic series, The Dark Instinct Trilogy. Welcome, Miguel. How are you?
I'm
Welcome.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. Pleasure to
Well,
be here finally.
well, thank you for joining us. God knows you run one of the longest, if not the longest, Gnostic podcast out there. I think we can all kind of tilt our hats to you for kind of getting all of this started.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been a while. I think it's going on 8 years now. I don't even know
Wow.
what I'm doing half of the time.
Well, you do it very well for somebody who
Oh,
doesn't know what he's doing. I do urge everybody to check out Miguel's show. It's absolutely awesome, and you get some great guests on there. And your introductory monologues are a thing of beauty.
it's an acquired distaste, as I like to tell people. It's something else. Yeah, I don't know why I do it either, but it just kind of all worked out that way.
Well, it makes us all happy.
A little less crazy, I hope.
A little less, little less. Okay, so Miguel, you're on. We're thrilled to have you on the show tonight, but we want to talk about something kind of specific, and that is the Jesus myth theory. What is this Jesus myth theory?
Excuse me, getting over a little flu here. Well, the Jesus myth theory is almost, you might say, it's probably been around a lot. People like to point to Albert Schweitzer's The Quest for the Historical Jesus as sort of one of the beginnings, although we do have some evidence that even in the Enlightenment period with Napoleon and others, this was coming about. And that is basically that there was... you can never say never in history, but there is a high probability that there was never a historical Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and that Jesus, as we know him, or more like Jesus of the Bible, is a composite figure. Now, there are many, you might say, Jesus myth theories. There are those who feel that Jesus is sort of a representation of the movement of the stars, astrotheology, as Cherry
Okay.
has appeared. There are others like Robert Price who see him as a composite figure of Old Testament characters, pagan characters, even many of Homer's stories. And there are others who simply feel he was basically an agenda of different forces like the Romans, and that you have
Mm-hmm.
Joe Atwill who advances that theory. So basically, yeah, Jesus is a myth, and where I come from is a myth with a capital M and not a myth with a capital with a small m.
This is a little different from what I remember, about 20 years ago when I went to seminary, where the main controversy was not over whether Jesus actually existed or there was a historical person on which the Gospels was based, but the idea back then is that, that there was absolutely a person who named Jesus or Joshua, on whom these stories were built around, for which these stories were built around. But there was never any question of the actual existence. Now, there was a lot of controversy. Did he rise from the dead? Did he actually do his miracles? What did he actually teach? But nobody ever really questioned that. But now the mythicist controversy has really come back full force.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's come back full force, and as scholars like Hector Avalos have proposed, it also has been fueled because New Testament scholarship has sort of hit a wall. They've done everything they wanted to do, and unfortunately, a lot of New Testament scholarship, whether it's secular, or religious, doesn't want to leave the New Testament. They don't want to go to Apocrypha. They want to pretend there's no Gnostic Gospels, so
Yeah.
they're sort of stuck. And the point is, and I think you hit upon it, Lainey, is it's not so much that Jesus is a myth, but as Albert Schweitzer would say, we don't know who the historical Jesus would be. I mean, the leading proponent might be Bart Ehrman, who says Jesus was an apocalyptical preacher. But there are others who say, well, Jesus was an Essene. He was a Stoic preacher. He was a Jewish reformer. He was this. So I think the main point, at least why I really embraced at the beginning, the Jesus myth theory, then there was more spiritual reasons, was the fact that we will never know who the historical Jesus is, unless somebody can build a TARDIS or something. We can go back there and find out who, behold a man. Who is this Jesus? Was that song by Dire Straits, Industrial Disease? Two men say they're Jesus. One of them must be right. I mean, will the real Jesus stand up? We'll probably never know who the historical Jesus. And history does tell us there were many Jesuses. Josephus does talk about the crazy Jesus, talking about the end of the world. He mentions a couple other Jesus and Joshua's, and there's all these prophets and mystics running around. So, yeah, there might have been actually many Jesuses, and Dire Straits was right.
That sounds like a great Kickstarter. It's getting money together for our TARDIS to go build and go back. We'll settle this whole thing. And Bart Ehrman and Richard Carrier can have a boxing match maybe to help raise.
It'd be lovely. Yeah, it'd be lovely.
But some people have been getting really touchy. You brought up Bart Ehrman, okay? And he is, as far as I know, an agnostic. He was an evangelical at one point. He's now an agnostic, but he's a New Testament scholar. And he's basically argued that, yes, there is a historical Jesus. We just don't know a whole lot about him. But that angered a lot of people. That angered some ethicists who got extremely up in arms about this. How do you explain that? Since Bart Ehrman is generally considered to be on the side of the a-religious, why did so many a-religious people get so upset with him?
Yeah, well, I don't want to slam anybody. I know all scholars work very hard. I mean, obviously Bart's a brilliant scholar. He works hard. He believes in what he believes, and so forth. But I think the issue might be is that the Jesus myth theory just sort of came out in the late 90s and the early 21st century, and it was just basically untethered. So you had a lot of really good Jesus myth theories, and then you had a lot of crazy ones. I mean, Jesus the alien, and Jesus is a parallel with every god that ever existed. It just got a bit out of hand because there was no controls or framework. There's no Jesus myth conference or anything like that. So I can understand that a lot of scholars get angry because these guys have worked their lives for, and every time they're getting emails and posts of all these people with their pet Jesus theory. So in that way, I can understand why there was a bit of blowback on the whole issue.
Sure, I can see that. Bishop Ken?
Well, I guess some of the questions I would have, I mean, some of the arguments I see is that there's not a lot of historical evidence to prove outside of, let's say, the Gospels and the canon text that there was Jesus. But is there any other historical evidence or any other evidence to kind of prove that he didn't exist? I mean, do we have writings? I mean, many, I think, would argue that there are writings that kind of prove that there was a historical figure of Christ. What are the major evidences that, it is just a myth?
Well, obviously we have, this would be a long argument. And again, there's different angles you want to take. The idea of his parallels with other gods, the idea that there's no really contemporary witnesses outside of the Bible of Jesus, the idea of Paul's sort of mythical Christ who has very little to do with being on earth. The idea of different mystery religions that were just kind of churning and pumping in those days, and suddenly Jesus seems to represent more what they are. I mean, there's so many different theories. It'd be hard to go. You could write a whole book about it, and there have been many books written about it. You guys have had, from Tin Freak to Chariot S, Robert Price, Richard Carrier. I mean, there's a whole industry there, and even today, unfortunately, there's even a sort of a mythicist civil war going on between different factions. So it is what it is. It's only, we always laugh, but God, the Gnostics were definitely infighting and breaking apart from each other. I mean, it's what intellectuals and mystics do. We break apart, we create our own little groups, and that's what happens. So
let me ask you. Sorry, go on, Ken.
I was going to say, do you think that then a Gnostic, would they be more in favor of embracing the idea of a mythical Jesus? And if so, what would be your reasoning for that?
Well, we know historically that the Gnostics had obviously different theories about Jesus. I mean, you even have, for example, who is it? Einar Thomason talks about you had the Eastern Valentinians who thought Jesus was, a phantom, the docetic Jesus. You had the Western Valentinians who thought he was a fleshy Jesus. You had different sects that had different ideas, but I don't think they really cared when it comes down to it, because they were really from that sort of Platonic view where, not even Platonic view, where they were more interested in the liberating power of myth. And it's probably interesting, too, of what they did. I was talking to Dylan Burns, who's been on the show, and I had the honor of meeting at the Gnostic Countercultures Conference. And he talked about how the Gnostics were radical than any other faith, because with the Platonic schools and Neoplatonism and even Judaism, you looked at the old stories and whether, obviously Plato and those guys thought these were just myth. There was places to find allegory and didactic lessons and so forth. The Jews did it too, especially the more Platonic Jews. Now, the Gnostics, of course, had to ruin it all, because they were not going to just go and read some story of their hero and, sort of find a nice little lesson about life. And they were going to just rewrite the whole thing to suit themselves. And then the next guy was going to rewrite it. And they were going to find ways to deconstruct and break it all open. So, of course, when they heard about the figure of Jesus, they were off to the races. They were just going to rewrite and create this amazing fan fiction and reboot the character and create the sequel and the whole franchise, and joining him with Seth and Zoroaster. So it's hard to see with the Gnostics, because, again, they were just off to the races. They were going to rewrite Jesus. They were going to find different types of Jesus. I mean, you always have like Jesus in the Secret Book of John. He's the sort of shape-shifting Jesus. You've got the Superman Jesus in the Pistis Sophia, who can lift up the zodiac and, go down into the depths and see Hecate. So you have so many different types of Jesus. And in a Gnostic worldview, that's just fine. That's exactly what you do. I mean, they were as Tony calls them, they were the punk rockers. They were the geeks, the comic geeks of their times. They were going to rewrite it and find different Jesuses that would work. And in a sense, humanity has done that, but Orthodoxy just doesn't want to admit it, because Jesus does change with the times. In the medieval times, you had Jesus who was the crusader Jesus with the sword. You had in the Victorian times, he was the conservative Jesus. A few generations, you had the hippie Jesus. Now these days, he's everything. He's a liberal Jesus. He's a conservative Jesus. He's the environmentalist Jesus. So humanity does that with Jesus, except the Gnostics at least admitted it and didn't have a problem saying this guy is a Rorschach test. He's a reflection of our innermost processes that we are projecting onto our stories and onto our culture. So I hope I answered your question. I don't know where I went with that tangent.
You had me thinking about Buddy Christ there just for a second.
Exactly.
That's it.
Which is one of my absolute favorite movies, and I think that it has, if you guys have not seen Dogma or you haven't seen it in a while, go get it. It's on Netflix, I'm sure. It's an incredible movie. I think one of the most important religious films of our time.
Yeah, any movie with Jesus I love. I don't care if it's The Passion of the Christ or Jesus Christ Superstar. I can't get enough. I mean, he's a great God-man of our times. He's a great symbol of the dying and rising God, the rebirth, the tragic hero. I mean, again, I love it. When I found out about the Christ myth theory to reading like Tim Freak and the Chariots, I wasn't one of those people that was going like, ha ha ha, this is going to exorcise all my demons and screw you, religion. I was like, oh wow, I can finally let go, because all my life I would read the Bible and I didn't know who Jesus was, and it was confusing. When I saw him as a myth of the times, that's when I felt really liberated. And I wasn't too concerned about the historical Jesus, but I was like the Gnostics, off to the races with the mythic Jesus, the Jesus that would show hopefully my inner divinity and the inner divinity of others. So that was my take.
I think I think it's fascinating. We've brought up this subject a couple of times on this show. We've had Tim Freak on the show. We've talked about this with Bishop Kaiser. We've had this conversation, just casually about, would, if it was proven tomorrow, somebody did find a TARDIS and it was absolutely proven that there was no Joshua on which the Christ myth is based, but there definitely was this myth that obviously existed. I think both Bishop Ken and I said we would continue to be clergy.
Mm-hmm.
I've run into the Christ myth or the mythicist idea among some pretty hardcore atheists who regard religion as a mental illness. But I don't find, as a religious person, I don't find any particular contradiction between the idea of Christ as myth. I actually do believe that there was a Jesus, but I'm not disturbed by the idea that there may not have been.
Yeah, I'm the same way. It's not going to really, whether there's a historical Jesus or not, it's not going to change a single thing. I mean, if somebody showed me there was a historical Doctor Who or Batman, it's not going to change what I feel about this, or Cthulhu. I mean, these stories are as I mentioned, they're for my inner processes. They're for my divine spark to be able to grow. Alan Moore said all history is fiction. And in a way, he's right. It all is just sort of this flowing and moving thing. So like you, I'm not really worried about these things, but it's fun to learn. It's fun to debate. It's fun to see all the speculations out there. It's all fun and games until somebody loses a third eye, as I like to say. So far, I don't think we've lost our third eye yet.
We are going to have to wrap up the show a little bit, but we'll have you on After Dark in a few minutes. But Miguel, where can people find you online?
My homepage would be thegodabovegod.com, and that's where you'll find, everything, the podcast, the books, everything. You might even find a historical Miguel if you look hard enough. Maybe you won't. I don't know. We'll see.
All right. Well, to our audience, what are your thoughts and theories and speculations on the historical Jesus? Do you believe Jesus was a myth, or do you believe that the Gospels are reliable, or do you believe that there was a historical figure named Joshua, but that we don't know a whole lot about him? We'd love to hear from you in the YouTube comments as well as on our Facebook page. Also, coming up next week, we're going to be discussing early Christianity and magic with Deacon Michael Stroyan from the Apostolic Joanite Church. We're really looking forward to that. Deacon Stroyan has been on the show before. He's a great guest, incredibly knowledgeable, and also a practitioner. So it'll be wonderful to have him join us next week. So again, I want to thank you, Miguel, for being on the show. We love everything that you do. You've been a great inspiration for all of us here, I know. And we look forward to talking with you over on After Dark.
All right, I'll be there. Thanks for having me on. You guys are doing great. You're putting me to shame. Keep it up. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody. Take care.
Good night.
We no longer